This is really interesting, guys. Switzerland just initiated a massive new military deal with the US, which includes 36 of the newest generation of fighter jets and surface-to-air missile defense systems. The whole deal is worth more than $16 billion, but maybe what's more important is the statement that this deal makes. This is all part of the world's largest weapons project started by the US under the Trump administration and now carried on under Biden as well. So 15 nations have now bought into this weapons project by buying these jets. But what's interesting is that until now, they've all been allies or at the very least very close partners with the US. Switzerland is different because they are notoriously neutral. And even though they were offered these big deals with their typical partners in Europe, which would have cost them way less, by the way, they specifically chose the US for this deal. The reason it's interesting that Switzerland chose to jump on this deal is that the US has been very clear that they are creating these deals with other nations to create closer military ties in the face of all of these other superpowers ramping up their military capabilities. So by signing this contract, the Swiss are effectively sending out a signal on where they would stand if a potential conflict were to break out. And exactly because it looks like Switzerland are choosing sides by entering into this deal, it's meeting a lot of opposition by politicians like Priska Graf, who's saying that the decision is simply incomprehensible. It's not just about buying them, but the upkeep and operating costs. We should seek a European solution. We don't want to be dependent on the United States. She's actually bringing up an important point here that I wanted to highlight with this story. If you enter into this deal with the US, you're effectively sending out a signal saying that we're willing to create, at the very least, create closer military ties with the US. And I don't think that's bad at all. But typically, Switzerland is staying away from all of that. So far, the other countries buying into this deal have all been allies like Belgium, Denmark, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Britain, and so on. So to give you guys some context here, at least for the Swiss side, what I think is happening here with Switzerland choosing the US over France and other European allies that they typically would choose is that recently Switzerland had some very important trade talks breaking down with the EU. They couldn't come to terms, and it basically ended up with them completely dismantling the talks because they couldn't agree. The trade talk completely collapsed, and I think this is Switzerland sending a message saying that we don't need the EU. If the EU is not willing to budge on trade talks, we're going to go elsewhere with our business. But there's also a downside for the Swiss to doing this because, as you might know, Switzerland has almost the purest form of democracy you can have in this world, and almost 50% of people were against funding for this deal just 1 year ago. So you can safely assume that there'll be a referendum within Switzerland on this very deal. Not if the deal will take place, because it will at this point, but how much money will be spent on the deal will be up for grabs. Last year, the Swiss voted that $6 billion would be used on this deal, but now the total deal is worth $16 billion, so way more. So the deal will take place, but I would expect that they would be getting a bit less than the 36 F-35A fighter jets than they were talking about. It's really interesting to see all of these military deals and pacts being created by the US all across Europe, now under Biden, but it also began under Trump, where the US has successfully rallied militarily a lot of nations lately. This is mostly concerning Europe, but Trump was also focused on creating military defense pacts with India and Australia in the South China Sea to prevent China from expanding too much. Now the US is doing the same thing across Europe and bringing in new allies at the same time. And it follows a clever pattern of using diplomacy to get what you want. When India were having their border disputes with China, the US was quick to step in and offer this military defense pact that they happily agreed to in India. Now that the Switzerland is having a dispute over trade agreements with the EU, the US is quick to step in and offer this new military deal with Switzerland as well. It kind of follows the same pattern. I'm not saying this because I think it's good or bad. I'm saying it because whoever is pushing for these deals behind the scenes, it's certainly not the making of whatever president is in office at the moment. These deals are all made outside of the US military, outside of the US presidency. They're brokered by US companies, not the US military. So when Biden was recently in Geneva in Switzerland to meet up with Putin, at the same time he was lobbying for US companies, not the US government, for the Swiss government to take this military deal with these US military groups. It just kind of tells you that the US president is not really in power when it comes to these long-term plans that the US has for the world. And that kind of makes you wonder who is. I think that's a question worth wondering about. Thanks for watching, guys. Remember to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.